Take a look at some of the statements issued by the Joe Biden administration since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The US president says, "No nation, no aggressor is allowed to take a neighbor's country by force." He says that Ukrainian children being displaced is an absolute outrage. The White House has stated that it condemns the Russian government's continued targeting and repression of journalists, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken has asserted that Russia must stop the weaponization of hunger. All valid points, you would say, right? Except the US does not seem to bat an eye when Israel commits such acts using American weapons and American money. A year since Hamas's attack that killed 1,200 plus Israelis with 250 plus taken hostage, Israel has expanded the war to Lebanon, and its atrocities in Gaza are not expected to subside anytime soon. Now keep America's gospels in mind when I say that in Gaza, more than 40,000 people have been killed by Israel since 7th October 2023, most of them civilians and one-third children. More than 130 journalists have been killed by Israel. The United Nations says that as of July 2024, Israel's targeted starvation campaign had spread throughout the entire Gaza Strip, causing the death of children. And on land, well, it's common knowledge and acknowledged by the UN and the International Court of Justice that Israel has been occupying the West Bank since 1967 and had occupied Gaza from 1967 to 2005. 20 days after Hamas's brutal attack, Israel launched a full-scale invasion and occupied Gaza again. Now, the brutalities have expanded to Lebanon, and while targeting the Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah, Israel's airstrikes have killed so far over 1,000 people in Lebanon. On 23rd September, it killed more than 500 people across southern and eastern Lebanon in a single day, according to Lebanon's health ministry, which, by the way, is not controlled by Hezbollah. And it has also assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader for the last 32 years, along with many other senior commanders of the organization. Iran retaliated with hundreds of ballistic missiles on 1st October, almost all of which were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. Netanyahu has sworn to hit back, but in what shape and form, we still don't know. So, 1 year on, Israel is not only not de-escalating, it is actually expanding its military operations. And the United States is not only permitting this, it is funding it with billions of dollars in military aid, with the last package worth $8.7 billion secured on 26 September. Among other destructive weaponry, the Biden administration has sent more than 10,000 highly destructive 2,000-pound bombs since the start of Israel's assault on Gaza. It is now confirmed that Israel has used these bombs in Gaza, and it is very likely that these are the bombs that were used in the strike that killed Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut. When questioned about Israel's actions, Washington parrots the same arguments time and again, that Israel has the right to defend itself, that reports of some of Israel's actions are concerning, and that it is waiting to see reports of Israel's investigation on atrocities committed by Israel.
What ought to happen is that there ought to be an investigation. Israel ought to conduct an investigation. If it's IDF soldiers, the IDF ought to conduct the investigation. If it's INP, it ought to be the INP that conducts an investigation. If they find wrongdoing, there ought to be full accountability and full transparency.
So, what explains Israel's impunity? Why is Israel untouchable? It would be far too simple to say that the Israel lobby in the US, with groups like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee or AIPAC, simply dictates American foreign policy making. Now, while this is true to a certain degree, we must look at the US's unequivocal support for Israel from 4 other angles. So let's go back a few decades. Long before AIPAC or Iran or elections, the key factor for US support was based on Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is a term associated with conservative Christians who believe that the modern nation-state of Israel is the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy, and this has impacted both British and American policy even before the creation of Israel in 1948. Scholars argue that Christian Zionism preceded organized Jewish Zionism, and much of the initiative for this actually came from Britain. Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917 in support of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, and this was the first public expression of support for Zionism by a major political power. And 30 years later, US President Harry Truman recognized Israel, given he was sympathetic to Zionism because of his evangelical Christian upbringing. He endorsed the 1947 UN partition plan for Palestine to create an Arab state and a Jewish state, and despite opposition from within the administration, he recognized the state of Israel. More than 70 years later, Christian Zionism remains a powerful religious force and a political force in American politics, and continues to greatly impact US foreign policy and America's geostrategic interests in the Middle East. Christian Zionists have been among Donald Trump's biggest supporters, and through his administration, they achieved many of their political aspirations, such as moving the US Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. Another factor that drives the US-Israel special relationship, as John F. Kennedy called it, appears to be the broad and deep support for Israel among the American public. A Pew Research poll held in March earlier this year stated that roughly 6 in 10 Americans say Israel's reasons for fighting Hamas are valid. The public also supports Israel because of the American moral image of Israel, that is the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, there are two things to note here. One, Israel in itself is a highly flawed democracy, and this goes beyond Israel's occupation and settler policies in the West Bank and Netanyahu's confrontation with the judiciary that led to mass protests before the 7th October attack. It is also about how a supposedly democratic country like Israel treats its own citizens. Many of the rights accorded in Israel stem from ethnicity and not citizenship. An Arab Israeli and a Jewish Israeli, both citizens, enjoy different rights, and the privileges that they possess are determined by ethnicity. In fact, Amnesty International has stated on record that whether they live in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, or Israel itself, Palestinians are treated as an inferior racial group and systematically deprived of their rights. We found that Israel's cruel policies of segregation, dispossession, and exclusion across all territories under its control clearly amount to apartheid. And secondly, talking about shared values, let's not fool ourselves about the US's concern for democracy. It, after all, has a history of overthrowing democratically elected regimes and propping up friendly dictators for its own geopolitical benefits, like with Iran 1953, Guatemala 54, Congo 1960, Dominican Republic 1961, South Vietnam 1963, Brazil in 1964, and Chile in 1973. The US extends support to a nation not based on how democratic its political system is, but how valuable is it for advancing US interests, which brings us to the third key driving force of this special relationship, which is Iran. Both Israel and the US regard Iran's growing power in the Middle East as the greatest threat to regional stability, and they both want to stop the rogue clerics in Tehran from having nuclear weapons. Relations between the US government and Iran's secular rulers flourished in the 1960s and the 70s, but since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, both nations have been bitter rivals. For the US, a militarily strong Israel is seen as necessary to prevent Iranian expansionism. Israel's military capabilities were on full display in the 1967 war, when it thrashed Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq in only 6 days. That is why US presidents from Kennedy to Nixon to Clinton to Obama, Trump, and Biden have all thrown their weight behind Israel. In fact, during his recent meeting with Israeli President Isaac Herzog, President Joe Biden repeated a line he famously said in 1986.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel.
And finally, we must remember that US aid to Israel is not charity. The US seeks to gain economically as well as militarily from its aid to Israel. Historically, Israel has received more US aid than any other country, more than $300 billion in total economic and military assistance since its founding in 1948. However, the American weapons that Israel purchases are produced in factories across the US, and the vast majority of the money that the US allocates to Israel each year has to be spent on American weapons. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the US accounted for 69% of Israel's imports of major conventional arms between 2019 and 2023. And in August, less than 2 months ago, the Biden administration approved the sale of fighter jets and other military equipment to Israel worth $20 billion. Net-net, what we conclude is that American support for Israel, especially during an election year, is not going to go down, even if Israel escalates its atrocities further by invading Lebanon. Innocent blood is being shed in Gaza and Lebanon, and for that, the accountability must lie with both Israel and the country that is aiding it. Amidst all of this, perhaps it will be pertinent to end this video with the words of Noam Chomsky after he was asked if he considers Hezbollah a terrorist organization.
هل تعتقد أن حزب الله منظمة إرهابية؟
The United States considers Hezbollah a terrorist organization, but the term terrorism is used by the great powers simply to refer to forms of violence of which they disapprove. So the U.S. was, of course, supporting the Israeli invasions and occupation of southern Lebanon. Hezbollah was instrumental in driving them out. So for that reason, they're a terrorist organization.